When you hear the term mausoleum, what comes to mind? Usually it's a large stone tomb, a visual testament to the person who was laid to rest inside. Audacious at best, gaudy at worst. These enormous graves are one last hurrah to show off just how important that person was, or how important that person thought they were. History is no stranger to large tombs to remember the dead. The Great Pyramids of Giza and the Terracotta Army in China are both examples of monumental funerary architecture, but we don't call either of those mausoleums. But could we? What exactly is a mausoleum? Where did this type of tomb come from? And who built the first one? Let's get into it. The first mausoleum was both a monument and tomb to the king Maussollos, who ruled over Caria, a kingdom in western Anatolia that was under the control of the Persian Empire from 337 to 353 BCE. Maussollos was the son of Hecatomnos of Mylassa, and during his reign moved his kingdom's capital to Halicarnassus, which is modern-day Bodrum in Turkey. Halicarnassus was already quite a bustling ancient city that dated back to the Bronze Age and was by then already famous because it was the birthplace of the 5th century historian Herodotus. Apart from building his mausoleum there, Maussollos also gave Halicarnassus new life by initiating multiple large-scale building projects such as a new harbor, a palace, and several temples. Overall, Caria thrived under Maussollos. He grew the eastern trade with Mediterranean cities like Rhodes, and he also created a new and improved road network that connected Caria further inland. He also married his sister Artemisia, who ancient writers credit with the actual building of his mausoleum. Aw, a love monument! I want someone to build me one of these bad boys now. I actually worked on a love monument in like the middle of the forest in Germany back in 2017, and it was wild. That's the ultimate flex, I think, for me. I want me a love monument, you guys. By ancient standards, this tomb was so large and lavishly decorated that it quickly made it onto ancient writers' lists of the 7 sites to be seen in their known world. And it's because of Maussollos' tomb's popularity that by the time the Romans showed up to the party, the word mausoleum had become the go-to word for any large tomb. And we still use this word today. Because the building of the mausoleum at Halicarnassus has been credited to Artemisia, ancient writers date its construction to the 2 years between Maussollos' death and hers, which is between 353 and 351 BCE. But given the actual size and detail of the tomb, it was definitely too large to have been started and completed in this time frame, and archaeologists believe its construction must have begun sometime during Maussollos' lifetime. He may have started building it shortly after he moved the capital to Halicarnassus as a political move to state his importance or to even give legitimacy to his decision. As with most of history, we'll never know because it was never specifically written down, and if it was, it hasn't survived long enough to give us all the answers we need. Because of this, archaeologists believe the construction of the mausoleum began around 370 to 365 BCE, and it was shortly finished after Artemisia's death around 350 BCE. The mausoleum was located at an elevated part of the city above the harbor. It was designed as a sacred monument for Maussollos and his family and was connected to the agora, or the central public gathering and marketplace, by a monumental staircase. If you visit the site today, all that's left standing in situ is the rectangular cutting into the rock that it sat on that was made for the foundations, the western staircase that led down to where Maussollos' body would have been buried, and a bunch of broken columns and architectural pieces that were sort of just placed around the area. Much of what has survived of the mausoleum that wasn't dismantled and repurposed is now at the British Museum. So if you did want to see parts of this particular wonder of the ancient world without trying to pick out pieces from the tomb that haven't been used in the construction of newer buildings, which we'll get into in a minute, that would be the best place to do it. I'm not saying it's the only place or the best place, it's more just based on your own preference. According to the Roman architect Vitruvius, who lived during the 1st century CE, the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus was designed by Satyros and Pythias of Priene. The tomb was constructed out of Anatolian and Pentelic marble, and it was probably inspired by the rock-cut monumental and pillar tombs of Lycia, an area that Maussollos had invaded and annexed around 3 360 BCE. Some famous examples of these would be the Nereid Monument and the tomb of Pythia. And this tomb's design has parallels with Indian architectural features, so it's all a big web of people taking inspiration from each other, which is what I think makes human artistic development and progress so marvelous and interesting. As Mark Twain said, there are no original ideas. We just jumble old ideas up into a kaleidoscope, turn it around, and see what new combinations we can make. Another account of the mausoleum comes from Pliny the Elder. In his natural history, he describes the tomb as 63 feet in the north and south sides, shorter on the facades. Its total circumference is 440 feet. It rises to a height of 25 cubits and is surrounded by 36 columns. Above the colonnade is a pyramid, equal in height to the lower part, contracting by 24 steps to the topmost point. On the summit is a marble 4-horse chariot made by Pythias. When this is included, it brings the whole building to a height of 140 feet. While some of Pliny's math was just a little bit wrong, archaeologists have been able to determine that at its base, the mausoleum probably measures 120 by 100 feet to equal Pliny's 440-foot circumference. From there, it rose into 3 sections: a podium or base 60 feet in height, a colonnade of 36 Ionic columns around, most likely 9 on the shorter sides and 11 on the longer ones, all topped with a stepped pyramidal roof with a 4-horse chariot, which from other sources we know had a massive statue of Maussollos fashioned after the likes of Hercules as the cherry on top. Now that sounds like a tomb worthy of a king. Pliny also mentions that the mausoleum was decorated by 4 famous Greek sculptors that were each responsible for their own side of the tomb. Scopas, the man who was in charge of rebuilding the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, which we talked about in the last Wonders video, took the east side. Byraxus took the north, Timotheus was on duty for the south, and Leocores was in charge of the west. And of course, we can't forget Pythias, who made the chariot. Artemisia really spared no expense when it came to ensuring her husband's tomb would be a marvel for millennia. I mean, she was buried in it too, along with like the descendants of their family, so I'm sure she had her own best interests in mind as well. And rightly so. Good for her. The fact that we have the names of most of the artists who were in charge of the decoration of the tomb really emphasizes that it wasn't just the scale of the tomb that made it famous. Oh no, it was the lavishness, the pomp, and the pure artistic skill and magnificence that made this mausoleum a wonder of the ancient world. Excavations at the site where the mausoleum once stood began in 1857 and have revealed fragments of the 24-stepped pyramidal roof, the chariot sculpture, and 36 columns. It was also determined that a 2-meter high wall surrounded the entire structure. 66 larger-than-life statue fragments were found in a deposit in the northeast corner of the mausoleum. For context, here is 5'7" me standing next to some of the colossal statues that were found, and these two have been attributed to possibly being Maussollos and Artemisia themselves. They're pretty big, you guys. Pretty big. A giant fragment of one of the chariot horses was also found, as well as several lion statues that once stood at the base of the pyramidal roof and the head of Apollo. A wheel fragment that is probably from the chariot was also found, and its size suggests that the complete chariot wheel would have been over 2 meters in diameter. This, with the horse fragment, shows that the entire sculpture that topped the tomb would have been about 6 meters high. Just the top sculpture. That's huge. In total, the tomb was decorated with over 100 freestanding marble sculptures that would have been painted in bright colors and have been decorated with bronze accents like armor, weapons, horses' reins, and crowns. This level of scale is absolutely astounding. You can tell just by the size and number of the decorative stonework that we found how lavish everything must have been. On top of these huge statues, the tomb was also decorated with marble friezes. Like the statue of Zeus at Olympia, which is another ancient wonder of the world that we've talked about, which means there's even more overlap with these ancient wonders, the mausoleum also had an Amazonomachy scene of the Greeks fighting the Amazons, located either just below the colonnade or on the walls of the tomb chamber. Seems like like Maussollos took a lot of inspiration from the Greek world here. There was also a frieze depicting chariot racers and another frieze around the base of the chariot on the roof that was decorated with fighting centaurs. Like Carian, the tomb itself was an eclectic mix of architectural features from Greek, Egypt, and the Near East. The high podium is characteristic of Lycian tombs, as I mentioned earlier, and above that we have the Ionic Greek columns that have Ephesian elements with their fluted columns and elaborate bases. Again, think of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus in the previous Seven Wonders video. And finally, on top, a stepped pyramid that is very Egyptian. While the architecture itself was quite the mélange, the decoration and sculpture was still very much Greek, which gives us an insight into what Maussollos' tastes were. The mausoleum stood watch over Halicarnassus for multiple centuries, surviving the invasion of Alexander the Great in 334 BCE and other attacks throughout history, until it was severely damaged in an earthquake sometime between the 11th and the 15th centuries CE. So that stood for a really long time, you guys. By the early 1400s, only the base of the mausoleum would have been recognizable, meaning it was ripe for plundering and repurposing. And that's exactly what happened. In the later years of that century, the Knights of St. John of Rhodes invaded the area and built Bodrum Castle. And then when they decided to fortify this castle and needed all this building material to do so, they didn't have far to look. There was just this decimated hunk of marble just sitting right there on the hill. That means the long walls of the castle were built from the blocks of green volcanic stone that formed the core of the mausoleum, and the marble blocks that formed the outer facing of the tomb, including many of the marble sculptures, were mostly broken up and burnt into lime to create mortar. But don't worry too much, it's not all gone. The friezes of the battle between the Greeks and the Amazons and parts of lion and leopard sculptures were built into the walls for decoration. It was actually these sculptures that sparked the first excavations of the mausoleum due to travelers in the 18th and 19th centuries noticing this and making some very educated guesses about them. And it made sense that the knights used these stones because they're already squared. It already takes a lot of that work away from you. So you just pick up the stone and you put it where you need it to go. And it did mean that much of the original context of the architectural pieces and sculptures were lost, but we also may have to thank the knights in helping to preserve some key elements of the tomb by reusing them, even if they did do a decent amount of destruction by burning a lot of that limestone into lime mortar. But nobody's perfect, you guys. And don't forget that ever since the Industrial Revolution, we as a society have developed a very different relationship with history than other people would have in different time periods. Research by Anthony Luttle shows that the knights continued to plunder the tomb until 1522. By this time, barely anything was left of the mausoleum except for its foundations. Even the tomb chamber itself had been found, opened up, and just completely looted. And the cool thing is, we have an account of the knights digging at the site and their discovery of the tomb chamber from Claude Guichard in 1581. According to him, they came upon the chamber that was set within the podium of the mausoleum and found an urn with a gabled lid of white marble. They weren't able to open it that day and had to retreat, but when they came back the next morning, the tomb had been opened and gold cloth and spangles had been strewn all over the ground. It was believed at this time that pirates had come in the dead of night and found unspeakable treasure. I love a good treasure story. While this story may sound like quite the fantastical one, archaeological excavations in the vicinity of the tomb chamber do actually point out some truth in it. Fragments of a gabled lid were found, which seem to have been part of a sarcophagus made out of white alabaster, and it seems like the cremated remains of Maussollos would have been wrapped in a gold embroidered cloth and then set inside this sarcophagus. They also found gold spangles in the area, which adds further evidence to Guichard's story. It's so amazing when storied accounts like this actually have archaeological proof to back it up. I love it so much. It keeps you going as an archaeologist, you know? You just have that what if, and it just gives you that hope. Archaeologists have also found evidence for a ritual food deposit within the tomb chamber. It was filled with the remains of sheep, oxen, goat, calves, chicken, doves, geese, and eggs. Oh, that's a lot of food. This kind of food offering for the dead is very much a Near Eastern funerary tradition, again showing that blending of cultures from all over the Eastern Mediterranean. The food has been interpreted to possibly suggest that the mausoleum was actively used as a place of worship for a hero cult that was set up for Maussollos as the refounder of Halicarnassus around 370 BCE, but there is also the possibility of the deposit being the remains of a sending off or funerary feast for the dead king. We don't have any historical references actually indicating that Maussollos thought of himself as or tried to make himself a god, so a hero cult is probably out of the question. But if an ancient Greek person were to look at the mausoleum and see the chariot on top, it probably would have definitely would have given them the idea that Maussollos was deified. And this right here is how the tomb became so well known and idolized enough to become an ancient wonder. Maussollos combined monumental architecture and colossal sculpture not to commemorate a god, but to celebrate a mortal being. This was something very rare in the ancient world. Even the pyramids of Egypt were for the pharaohs, who were considered gods on earth and intermediaries between the gods and the people down below. In all likelihood, this whole monumental structure was a founder's tomb, commemorating Maussollos as the refounder of Halicarnassus and stating the supremacy of Caria over all of the civilizations that the tomb took inspiration from. It's possible that Maussollos wanted his mausoleum to symbolize a fusion of all the surrounding civilizations and cultures, maybe even with the hopes of establishing a Carian empire with Halicarnassus at its center. While that didn't happen, he did succeed in creating one of the greatest known tombs of the ancient world and one of the longest surviving wonders. Thanks so much for watching, you guys. If you liked that video, you know what to do. Hit the like button, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss out on the rest of this Ancient Wonders series. If you find a lot of value in these videos and you want to help support me in making them and maybe hopefully achieving the dream of doing this full time, head on over to Patreon and become a patron. You get early access to all of my videos, you get behind the scenes updates, and you might even get some cool free stuff on the side as well. Stay dirty, my friends.